Okay, everybody, let's dive into manslaughter. The first thing I'll go through is voluntary manslaughter, the kissing cousin of first-degree murder. And I say a kissing cousin because voluntary manslaughter and first-degree murder both still have the intent to kill. What do I mean by that? Let's dive into it. The definition of voluntary manslaughter is the intentional killing, right? The intentional killing of another with malice mitigated. This means that the defendant still intended to kill another, the victim, and the defendant still had malice when he or she committed the act. However, it's mitigated. It's not as serious as first-degree murder. Therefore, the intent to kill is still there, and the malice piece of wanting to end the life of another is still there as well. But the mitigated piece of it is what makes voluntary manslaughter so different from first-degree murder. What do I mean by that as well? The heat of passion is one of the types of voluntary manslaughter that we have to go through in order to comprehend exactly what this whole definition means. Okay? So the heat of passion has 4 important elements that you have to go through, one at a time on your written exam, and even in your mind when you are thinking about MBEs. So let's get into it. We have 1, 2, 3, and 4 elements to think about. Heat of passion means that the defendant was provoked, and the defendant acted with passion rather than reason due to this provocation that was acted upon by the defendant. Thirdly, it must be reasonable. So it's the reasonable, prudent, and person test. Basically, the reasonable person would have acted with passion rather than reason, just how the defendant did. Therefore, the defendant cannot have the past and say, oh, I acted with passion rather than reason, therefore I killed this person. The reasonable person must have acted the same way by this provocation. An example of how the defendant cannot use the heat of passion is if the defendant has some type of mental disorder. Let's say the defendant had anger issues. This is an example. Okay, his anger issues will make him get triggered off the slightest thing. You look at him the wrong way in the street and he kills you. He can't bring up heat of passion. There's just no way. There was no actual provocation that will make the defendant act with passion rather than reason. And the reasonable person, the reasonable and prudent person, RPP, reasonable and prudent person, would not have acted with passion rather than reason by having someone stare at him down. Right? So the important thing is the reasonable person under the defendant's similar or same circumstances must have acted with passion rather than reason. And the passion piece of it again is that the defendant killed another due to the provocation and acted rather than reason, because if the defendant was acting with reason, the defendant would not have acted in that way to end the life of another. Therefore, the provocation must be present and it must be reasonable. And lastly, for element number 4, there must be a cooling off period. An example of this, the all-star example of this under the common law, is that let's just say that the defendant came home from work early one day and found his wife in bed with another man. Let's say that my friend Israel went home from work and witnessed Riley and his wife Shantae having sexual intercourse in his bedroom. That is an example of the defendant being provoked. And let's say that when Israel saw this, he got a shotgun out of his closet and killed the man in the bed. That is an example of the defendant acting with passion rather than reason, because we all know that if Israel was acting with passion, he was acting with reason, he would not have killed that man. However, he acted with passion rather than reason. Therefore, element 1 and 2 satisfied. Element 1 satisfied because he saw the man in bed with his wife. Element 2 satisfied because the defendant acted with passion by killing the man with a shotgun rather than being reasonable and just walking away and cooling off. Element number 3 is for sure satisfied because any reasonable man under Israel's same or similar circumstances would have acted with passion rather than reason because that's his lover. Anyone would be mad if they saw their other half, with another person. And lastly, Israel could not have just saw this happen and walked away, and then a couple hours later he said, okay, I'm going to kill this person. I want to kill the man who slept with my wife. He cannot do that. The cooling off period really refers to the fact that the defendant must act passionately in a very quick manner. Therefore, acting right at that moment. That's what I'm trying to express here. Again, he cannot say that, oh yeah, I killed him a day later when I saw him at the grocery store. It must be something that he witnessed instantly by being provoked, and he must have acted with passion at that very moment. That is an example of the cooling off period. So all 4 elements here must be satisfied in order for the defendant to raise the heat of passion in order to mitigate his or her charge down to first degree murder or even murder to voluntary manslaughter because of the heat of passion. And the last 2 critical things to understand with voluntary manslaughter is imperfect self-defense and mistaken justification. So let's start at the top of the board to the bottom of the board by talking about imperfect self-defense. So imperfect self-defense really boils down to the defendant not having the reasonable belief to kill. An example of this, let's just say that someone has a concealed and carry. They're in possession of a 9mm gun, license to carry, and that man is walking along the road and someone jumps out of the bushes and scares him because it's Halloween. And the defendant, the man with the gun, reacts automatically and accidentally shoots that person because he was under fear that his life was at risk. However, it was just a small child playing a prank. And because he shot that person, that child died. That is an example of imperfect self-defense because the defendant was not under any type of real harm. Because remember, as I said in other videos, self-defense means the defendant was under reasonable belief that he or she was under serious bodily harm or death by another. In my example, it was just a kid scaring another person with a deadly weapon, and that person happened to shoot and react, accidentally killing another. Therefore, imperfect self-defense may be something that the defendant can raise in order to mitigate his charge down from murder, first-degree murder, to voluntary manslaughter. So that is imperfect self-defense because, again, there is no reasonable belief to kill. That is imperfect self-defense. Lastly, we have mistaken justification. As I said, in defense of the homicide, justification is a defense that can be raised in order to acquit your charge completely. We have defense of property, which means your castle, right? Your house, your apartment. If you're a homeless person, your tent. Basically, your dwelling, where you sleep, where you reside. That is defense of property. Let's put a little check mark there. Self-defense, I just said that. Check. Defense of others. Basically, let's say that your mother is at risk of getting killed by another person because she is about to kill your mother with a gun. Let's say your mother's under imminent bodily harm or death by another crazy person. You step into your mother's shoes in order to save her life by killing that person who was about to kill your mother. That's defense of others. Crime prevention is basically when, let's just say, a school shooter comes into an elementary school and tries to shoot up the school. That is an example of where a security guard, a professor, or another student can use that amount of force in order to kill another who is causing serious bodily harm or death to another. Basically, crime prevention. Again, school shooters are committing a crime, right? Therefore, using deadly force in order to stop that person will be justified. Put check mark there. So mistaken justification under voluntary manslaughter is basically when defense of property, self-defense, defense of others, and crime prevention was mistaken. It just didn't cut it, right? It was unreasonable. It was not the reasonable belief. It was basically an unreasonable belief. No present danger was there. Therefore, mistaken justification will be raised in order to mitigate the defendant's charge from either murder or first-degree murder to voluntary man. That is voluntary manslaughter in a nutshell. And last but not least, let's get through involuntary manslaughter, which is very, very straightforward in my opinion. So IVM, involuntary manslaughter, means the unintentional killing, homicide, of another without malice. The defendant did not have the intent to kill, which is why it's called the intentional homicide of another. Without, I emphasize this, without malice, which means that the defendant ended up causing a death of another, but the defendant did not mean to kill another person. An example of this is criminal negligence. We have three types here: criminal negligence, misdemeanor manslaughter, and the intent to cause non-serious bodily harm. So criminal negligence is actually the most popular example, in my opinion, that you will see on your exams or even in real life. Is, let's just say that a mother feeds her newborn daughter, and she's a very irresponsible mother. Let's say she only breastfeeds her daughter twice a week, and over time the baby's malnourished and dies because the baby is not fed properly. The mother didn't mean to kill her child. However, because she was acting criminally negligent in what she did, right, not feeding her child properly, that is an example of her unintentionally causing the death of another, killing of another, and she did not have malice, right? So she didn't plan to kill her daughter. It just happened because she was criminally negligent. Therefore, worst case scenario, she's liable for involuntary manslaughter, IVM. Misdemeanor manslaughter, an example of that is larceny. We all know larceny: the trespasser taking and carrying away of another's property with the intent to permanently deprive the owner of that property. Basically stealing. Go to the store, steal a piece of candy, run away. That is larceny. So let's say in the commission of that larceny, you end up causing a death of another. That is an example of misdemeanor manslaughter. So during a petty misdemeanor, you caused the death of another, because your intent was to commit that misdemeanor. Your intent was not to commit a homicide. Again, that's why the definition is the unintentional homicide of another without malice. You didn't plan to do it. You didn't have the intent to do it. It just happened. That's why under misdemeanor manslaughter, you will be liable if you commit a misdemeanor and you cause the death of another. And lastly, we have the intent to cause non-serious bodily harm. So let's say you get in a fight and your victim ends up being a very sensitive person. An example of that, let's just say that your victim is easily knocked out and the person has head trauma, and during that trauma that person dies, has a concussion and dies. that is an example of you not wanting to cause the death of another. However, because you had the intent to cause non-serious bodily harm by just simply having a fist fight, you caused the death of that person. Therefore, you could be charged with involuntary manslaughter. Because again, you just wanted to beat that person up. You didn't have the intent to kill that person, right? The unintentional homicide. You didn't have the intent to kill. You didn't have the requisite plan. See, without malice, you had the requisite plan to kill that person. You just wanted to have a fist fight. However, because you caused that non-serious bodily harm to that victim, and that victim died because of that harm, you could be liable for involuntary manslaughter. If you have any questions on manslaughter, comment below. I will help you. Thank you.